Harold Bennett had everything: a respected career, a picture-perfect marriage, and a lifetime of admiration, until the night his wife Lillian exposed his darkest secret in front of 70 stunned guests, including the woman he thought no one would ever suspect. Harold Bennett was the kind of man people admired from a distance. At 70 years old, he carried the calm confidence of someone who had built a successful life and never needed to prove it. A retired cardiologist in the quiet town of Charleston, South Carolina, Harold had a reputation that stretched back decades. Patients spoke of his steady hands and warm demeanor, and neighbors often referred to him as the gentleman doctor. He had lived in the same grand colonial-style home for over 30 years with his wife, Lillian, a woman as composed and graceful as Harold was dignified. To most, they were a model couple, the kind others aspired to be. Their days were routine but peaceful. Every morning, Lillian prepared Harold's tea exactly the way he liked it. 1 sugar, no milk, and left it on the breakfast nook by the garden window. They read newspapers in silence, then Harold would take a slow walk around the yard, inspecting the roses, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stone path. It was the kind of life that suggested decades of harmony, built on trust and understanding. But under the surface, something had shifted. Lillian had begun to sense it, not in loud arguments or accusations, but in the small, unsettling changes that others might dismiss. Harold no longer looked her in the eyes for long. He chuckled less at her jokes, rarely asked her how her day was. When she passed by his study late at night, the glow from his phone illuminated his face, and he'd always tilt the screen away when she approached. She noticed how he'd stopped asking her to accompany him on errands, something they used to do together just to enjoy each other's company. She chalked it up to age. At first, maybe Harold was tired. Maybe he was feeling the weight of getting older, of slowing down. Still, the sense that something was off wouldn't let her rest. Her instincts had kept her safe in life, and now they were pulling at her again, quietly, but insistently. When Harold's health took a dip, Lillian insisted on hiring help. She found a private nurse named Ava, a young, seemingly responsible woman who came highly recommended. Ava was polite, quiet, and attentive. She worked 3 days a week, helping Harold with his medications, checking his blood pressure, and preparing light meals. At first, Lillian felt relieved to have someone capable around. But something about Ava didn't quite fit. She was too subtle, too polished. Her smile lingered a second too long. Her voice lowered just slightly when she spoke to Harold. Still, Lillian said nothing. She watched, listened, and waited. One afternoon, as Lillian folded laundry in the upstairs bedroom, she noticed Ava's car parked outside, despite it being Harold's fishing day with an old friend. The two weren't supposed to be home at the same time. Curious, she peered through the slats of the blinds, but saw nothing unusual. Harold had been increasingly secretive about these outings, always returning in a better mood, freshly showered, humming old jazz tunes. Then came the incident with the phone. Harold had left it charging in the kitchen while he napped, and it buzzed repeatedly. Lillian glanced at the screen, a name she didn't recognize. M. Just a letter, followed by a heart emoji. The message preview was short. Same time Thursday, can't stop thinking about. The rest was cut off. Her breath caught. She picked up the phone, stared at it, then placed it back down, exactly as it had been. A slow wave of nausea crept in. Something wasn't just wrong, it was about to spiral. And deep inside, she already knew the truth, even if she didn't yet have proof. The perfect life they had built was no longer perfect. And the deeper she looked, the darker it would get. The morning the pill bottle appeared, everything changed. It was one of those small, ordinary moments that Lillian might have overlooked on any other day. She was tidying Harold's dresser, rearranging the cluttered drawers he rarely bothered with, when her fingers brushed something cold and cylindrical pushed toward the back. She pulled it out without thinking, a white plastic prescription bottle with a worn label and a child-proof cap. But the name printed on it wasn't Harold's. It read Aaron Blake. Her first thought was that it had been left behind by a friend or perhaps a mistake from the pharmacy. But then her eyes dropped to the medication name, Sidonism. She didn't recognize it immediately. The print was small and her hands were suddenly shaking. She slipped the bottle into her sweater pocket and carried on as if nothing had happened. But her heart pounded heavily through the rest of the day. Later, once Harold was napping in his recliner, she searched the drug name online. The screen loaded slowly, each second stretching like a warning. When the results finally appeared, her breath caught again. Erectile dysfunction medication. A sudden coldness ran through her. Harold hadn't touched her in years, not since before his retirement. He'd always blamed age, medication side effects, and fatigue. They'd stopped trying, and she had made peace with it, telling herself love wasn't always about passion, but clearly, that wasn't true for Harold. She returned the bottle to its place that evening, exactly as she found it, careful not to leave a trace. She didn't mention it to him. She didn't ask questions. Instead, she watched, quietly, precisely. Over the next few days, Lillian started to piece things together, one fragment at a time. She remembered Harold's sudden change in mood every Tuesday and Thursday, days he claimed to be out fishing with Craig, a man Harold hadn't mentioned in years before this new routine began. Craig was a recluse, known to be private, and occasionally unwell. It struck her as odd that Harold, who barely texted their own children, was suddenly spending entire afternoons with an old acquaintance he barely spoke of before. That week, Lillian picked up the phone and called Craig directly. He answered with a hoarse hello, clearly surprised. She exchanged pleasantries before casually asking how their last fishing trip had gone. Silence. Craig hesitated, then admitted he hadn't seen Harold in at least 6 months. Something about his voice told her he was telling the truth. He sounded confused, maybe even a little embarrassed. Lillian ended the call, politely, but her mind was no longer calm. If Harold wasn't with Craig, where was he going, and who was he meeting? She began tracking his behavior. Not openly, she didn't want to alert him, but every time Harold left, she noted the time, what he wore, whether he carried his phone charger, how much cologne he applied. It was more than she expected. Every Thursday, he seemed more alert, more meticulous. He shaved more carefully. He wore newer clothes. Once she spotted a smudge of lipstick on his shirt collar barely visible, a soft nude tone that wasn't hers. She started checking bank statements. 2 unfamiliar restaurant charges appeared from a downtown bistro. One was listed as a Lutz for 2. Harold had claimed he'd eaten at the hospital cafeteria that day. Another. The nurse, Ava, crossed her mind more frequently now. There was something too convenient about her arrival. Too many coincidences, but Ava never acted openly inappropriate. Her professionalism never cracked, at least not when Lillian was in the room. That made her more dangerous. Lillian didn't yet know if Ava was connected to this, but her instincts told her to watch closely. Piece by piece, the facade of their life was crumbling. Each discovery added weight to Lillian's chest, but she didn't break. She became sharper, more focused. The truth was out there, and she was getting closer to it every day. Something was hiding in plain sight, and Lillian was determined to find it, no matter how devastating it would be. Lillian had always prided herself on her ability to read people. As a schoolteacher for over 30 years, she'd learned to sense dishonesty, fear, and defiance with just a glance. But Ava, the nurse she had welcomed into her home, was different. Ava was unreadable, and that alone made Lillian uneasy. When they had first interviewed caregivers for Harold's declining health, there were 3 options: an older, experienced nurse named Deborah, a former military medic named Carla, and then Ava, the youngest, quietest, and most polished of them all. Harold insisted that Ava seemed most adaptable. Lillian had agreed, wanting to trust his judgment. After all, Ava came with glowing references, a neat resume, and a soft, reassuring tone. She arrived promptly 3 times a week, wore pale blue scrubs, minimal makeup, and kept her chestnut hair tied back in a clean braid. At first, Lillian saw no reason for concern. Ava moved efficiently, took meticulous notes, and even labeled Harold's medications better than the pharmacy did. She rarely made conversation unless spoken to, and always excused herself before entering any personal space. But there were subtle things, almost too subtle, that began to unsettle Lillian. It started with the perfume. One day, as Lillian leaned in to hand Ava a cup of coffee, a familiar scent floated through the air. It was the exact perfume Lillian had worn for decades: lavender and cedarwood, custom blended by a boutique in Charleston that very few people knew about. She hadn't seen that bottle in weeks. The strange part was, Ava wasn't wearing perfume when she first started. Lillian was sure of it. Then came the necklace. It was a delicate gold chain with a tiny sapphire charm. Nothing flashy, but deeply sentimental. Harold had given it to Lillian on their 25th anniversary, and she hadn't worn it in years. But one afternoon, as Ava bent over to pick up Harold's reading glasses, the charm glinted in the sunlight. The same size, the same cut, the same sapphire. Lillian said nothing. She studied Ava like a hawk from then on. She noticed how Ava began staying a few minutes longer after her shift ended. Once she claimed she was organizing Harold's medications, but Lillian found the pill box untouched on the kitchen counter. Another time, she said Harold had asked her to stay for tea, a request Lillian never heard him make to anyone, even her. There was one afternoon when Lillian came home early from a grocery run. She entered the house quietly, her heels muffled by the thick foyer rug. The living room was silent, but a faint voice came from Harold's study. She moved carefully toward the door, and paused. Ava's voice. Low, almost affectionate. The door was slightly ajar, and Lillian glimpsed shadows too close together. By the time she stepped fully into the room, Ava was across the study, flipping through a medical journal. Harold sat in his chair, acting as though nothing had happened. It was seamless, perfect, almost rehearsed. That night, Lillian didn't sleep. She considered confronting them, but she needed proof. Real proof. She wasn't about to be dismissed as a paranoid old woman. She needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away. The next day, while Harold napped and Ava was out, Lillian retrieved a small motion-activated camera she had once bought for monitoring the backyard raccoons. She installed it discreetly behind a row of books on Harold's shelf, aimed perfectly toward his desk and chair. It was almost invisible. She didn't tell anyone, not her friends, not her niece, not even her children. If what she suspected was true, she would need to catch it on her own terms, quietly, carefully. Something was happening between Ava and Harold. The signs were everywhere now, and whatever it was being hidden in plain sight. Lillian could feel the truth pressing against the edges of her world, just waiting to burst through. She only needed to wait, and watch. 3 days. That's how long Lillian waited before checking the footage. It felt like 3 years. Each night she lay in bed beside Harold, his slow breathing steady as ever, while her thoughts twisted like tangled vines. Her heart thudded quietly, not in fear but in anticipation, like a slow drumbeat counting down to something she could feel but not yet see. She didn't tell him about the camera. She didn't even look at the bookshelf when she walked by. She treated each day like any other, brewing his tea, reminding Ava of his afternoon pills and making small talk over dinner. But her mind was never present. On the third night, long after Harold had drifted into one of his heavy, untroubled sleeps, Lillian slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway in her robe. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the cabinet under the sink and retrieved the small memory card from where she'd hidden it. She inserted it into her laptop, hesitated for just a second, and clicked play. The first day's footage showed nothing unusual. Ava entered the room, checked the bookshelf for dust, rearranged a few medical folders, and left. It was ordinary, harmless. The second day looked much the same. Lillian began to wonder if she had imagined it all. Maybe the shadows, the perfume, the necklace. Maybe she had connected dots that weren't really there. Then came the third day. The footage began with Harold entering the study alone. He wore his beige cardigan, the one he only wore on special outings. He moved more briskly than usual, and adjusted the blinds before sitting at the edge of the chair, glancing at his watch. A few minutes passed, then Ava entered. She wasn't in scrubs. She wore a soft, fitted sweater, and dark jeans clothes, far too casual for a shift. She walked directly over to him without speaking. Harold stood. The two faced each other for a long moment, then he reached for her hand. Lillian's breath caught. They sat down, closer than necessary, their knees nearly touching. Harold reached into a drawer and pulled out something small. Lillian couldn't make it out. Ava laughed and leaned her head against his shoulder. It was brief but intimate. Harold kissed the top of her head. Then came the moment Lillian would never forget. Ava took out her phone and turned it toward Harold. He leaned in to look. They both laughed. Harold placed his hand on her thigh. Her thigh. Lillian paused the video. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk, white-knuckled. For a long time, she didn't move. The image froze on the screen like a painting of betrayal, the room's warm lighting giving the moment a false softness. There it was. The confirmation. The end of the questions. The end of denial. She clicked play again. The pair continued their private exchange for another few minutes. Ava pulled out a small velvet box, opened it, showed Harold what was inside. A necklace. The necklace. The necklace. He touched it, smiled, and she leaned in again, too close, too comfortably. Then, just before the video ended, Harold glanced toward the door, stood, and gently brushed Ava's hair behind her ear. Lillian closed the laptop. There was no more speculation, no more suspicion. She had the truth in her hands, silent, irrefutable, and cruel. But what disturbed her most wasn't the affair itself. It was how natural it all looked. How practiced. How many times had this happened without her knowing? How many lies had been told with the same calm face Harold wore at dinner? She sat still for a long time. Then she pulled the flash drive from the laptop and locked it in her drawer. The surprise birthday party was just 2 weeks away, and now she had a surprise of her own. Lillian didn't cry. She didn't scream, throw things, or confront Harold with the footage. That wasn't her way. Instead, she went about her days like nothing had changed. She made coffee. She trimmed her roses. She even complimented Ava on the way she'd organized the medication cabinet. But beneath the calm surface, a quiet storm was building. The kind of storm that didn't rage, it calculated. Harold's 70th birthday was approaching quickly. Lillian had spent months organizing a surprise party at Charleston's most elegant waterfront hotel. It was meant to be a tribute to his life and legacy, a celebration of all he'd accomplished. But now, it was going to serve a very different purpose. She began to see every detail of the event through new eyes. The gold and navy invitations had already gone out. Over 70 guests were expected. Former colleagues, old friends, distant relatives, people who'd known Harold for decades. They all thought they were coming to honor a devoted husband and respected doctor. And they would. But not in the way they expected. Lillian reached out to her niece, Madison. Smart, resourceful, and fiercely loyal, Madison had always been Lillian's quiet ally in family matters. She was the only person Lillian trusted with the truth. One afternoon, they sat in the garden. Lillian wordlessly sliding the flash drive across the table. Madison plugged it into her laptop and watched in stunned silence. When the footage ended, she looked at her aunt with wide eyes and nodded. They began planning in secret. Madison handled the technical side, editing the footage, embedding it into a tribute video so skillfully that no one would suspect what was coming until it was too late. The video would begin like a standard celebration montage: baby photos, graduation snapshots, clips from Harold's medical career, family vacations. The music would be sentimental, the pace smooth. It would lull the audience into a state of nostalgia and admiration. Then, just after the final picture of Harold and Lillian on their 40th anniversary cruise, the screen would fade to black. That's when everything would change. Lillian wrote a short closing message to be read by the MC, a toast to truth, loyalty and love that withstands everything, even betrayal. It sounded poetic, almost abstract. But the meaning would become painfully clear seconds later. They tested the video twice, ensuring the transitions were flawless. Madison compressed the file and loaded it onto a password-protected USB drive that she would control until the moment of the reveal. They printed a backup copy, just in case. The guest list became a weapon in Lillian's hands. She invited everyone Harold respected, former partners from his practice, the hospital board chair, even his childhood best friend who hadn't seen him in 15 years. If she was going to expose him, it had to be in front of the people who believed in him the most. And then she invited Ava. She made the invitation sound warm, even affectionate, calling her the nurse who had become part of the family. She asked her to say a few words at the party, to thank her for her care and attention. Ava accepted without hesitation. Lillian spent the days leading up to the event in a strange, focused calm. She cooked, ironed Harold's dress shirt, scheduled his haircut. She even practiced her smile in the mirror, making sure it didn't shake. Harold suspected nothing. He spoke often of his party, excited to see old friends, pleased by Lillian's enthusiasm. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap. Lillian watched him carefully, memorizing his patterns, counting down the days. She wasn't planning a birthday celebration anymore. She was staging a public reckoning. The day of the party arrived cloaked in warm summer sunlight, casting golden rays through the windows of the Bennett home. Lillian rose early. She made breakfast just as she always did. Eggs soft, toast lightly buttered, tea exactly how Harold liked it. He sat at the table humming to himself, reading the newspaper, completely unaware that his carefully hidden secrets were hours away from being laid bare. By mid-afternoon, the hotel ballroom began to transform. Gold satin tablecloths, towering arrangements of white lilies, soft candlelight flickering against crystal glasses. It was the kind of setting that whispered elegance. A jazz trio rehearsed near the stage while the hotel staff arranged seating cards with delicate calligraphy. Every detail had been curated under the guise of celebration, but beneath it all pulsed something darker. Guests began to arrive in waves. Friends Harold hadn't seen in decades embraced him warmly, unaware they were walking into a ticking bomb. Colleagues shook his hand and congratulated him on a well-lived life. His children stood beside him, smiling, clinking glasses of champagne, taking photos for the family album. Everyone believed they were witnessing a joyful milestone. And Lillian? She was the perfect hostess. Poised, glowing, she wore an elegant navy gown, the same color as Harold's tie, and welcomed every guest with a gracious smile. No one saw the calculation behind her eyes, or the faint tremble in her fingertips hidden behind a clutch purse. Just before dinner was served, Ava entered. She wore a sleek black dress, far too bold for someone claiming to be just the nurse. She moved with the ease of someone confident in her place, not like an employee but something more. She made her way toward Harold, kissed him lightly on the cheek, just long enough to draw Lillian's attention, and slipped into a seat near the front. If she noticed the stares, she didn't show it. Madison gave Lillian a subtle nod from across the room. The video was ready. Dinner passed with laughter and toasts. Harold gave a short speech, thanking Lillian, his children, and the wonderful people who'd stood by him all his life. He didn't mention Ava by name, but his eyes lingered on her too long. Lillian noticed. So did Madison. Then the lights dimmed. A hush fell across the room as a soft instrumental played and the large projector screen came to life. The montage began just as planned. Childhood pictures of Harold splashed across the screen, him with his first dog, his high school graduation, his white coat ceremony in medical school. The audience murmured fondly, laughing at the dated hairstyles, wiping tears at family memories. Photos of Harold and Lillian appeared, young, happy, in love. Their wedding, the birth of their children, the holidays spent around warm fires. The last image was the two of them on a cruise deck, smiling into the sunset. Then the screen went dark. A few guests clapped, expecting it to end. But the music shifted, slower now, almost somber. The screen flickered, new footage appeared. The study, the bookshelf, Ava entering the room. At first, there was confusion, then realization. The crowd fell silent as they watched Harold appear in the frame. Greet Ava, sit close. The laughter, kiss, the touch. It was all there, caught on camera, impossible to deny. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a glass. A chair scraped the floor. The music stopped altogether. Harold stood frozen, staring at the screen, his face drained of color. Ava sat perfectly still. Lillian rose slowly from her seat, smoothed her dress, and turned to face the audience. She said nothing. She didn't have to. For a long, charged moment, no one moved. The ballroom, once filled with light and laughter, now hung in a thick, unnatural silence. Dozens of eyes flicked between the frozen screen, still showing Harold's hand on Ava's thigh, and the man himself, who stood as if rooted to the floor. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His carefully composed image, so long maintained, had cracked in an instant. The shock rippled across the room, friends whispered under their breath. Former colleagues looked away, uncomfortable. Some guests began pulling out their phones, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. Ava remained seated, her expression unreadable. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, as if waiting for it to disappear, willing it to turn back to the nostalgic photo montage it had started with. But there was no going back. The MC stood near the side of the stage, uncertain of what to do, his cue cards shaking slightly in his hand. Lillian, standing with perfect posture at her table, took a step forward. Her presence alone silenced the murmurs. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply turned to the room, gave a soft, almost sad smile, and nodded. It was a silent confirmation that what they had seen was not a cruel prank or digital trick. It was real. Her calmness was more unsettling than rage would have been. Madison appeared at her side, placing a gentle hand on her aunt's shoulder. Together, they walked toward the exit without saying a word. Lillian didn't look at Harold as she passed him. She didn't need to. His shame was written across his face, flushed skin, trembling hands, and eyes darting helplessly for something to hold on to. Some guests called after her, unsure whether to follow or remain. Others simply stood frozen, unable to process the spectacle. Lillian disappeared into the hallway, her heels echoing against the marble floor like punctuation marks in the silence behind her. Inside the ballroom, the damage was complete. Harold finally turned toward Ava, his expression contorted in disbelief, betrayal, and panic. Whether he was angry at her for not warning him or at himself for getting caught, no one could say. Ava stood slowly, keeping her head high, as she walked past the stairs and whispers. She did not apologize. She did not stay to explain. She vanished down the side hallway and out of the hotel, never to return. Harold was left standing alone beneath the soft glow of the chandelier, now looking more like a man at a funeral than one celebrating a milestone. The jazz trio had stopped playing long ago. The once beautiful birthday cake, trimmed in gold frosting and inscribed with 270 wonderful years, sat untouched. One by one, the guests began to file out. Some nodded politely. Others avoided his gaze entirely. His children, confused and embarrassed, stood off to the side, unsure of what they had just witnessed. They had questions, but they didn't ask them, at least not yet. By the time the room was nearly empty, Harold sat alone at a round table near the screen. The last photo of him and Lillian still lingered on the projector, flickering faintly. He stared at it for a long time, as if trying to rewind the moment in his mind, to unsee what had been seen. But it was done. The party was over, and the truth had taken center stage. The morning after the party, the sun rose like any other, indifferent to the wreckage it lit. But nothing felt ordinary. The Bennett home, once full of morning routines and soft silences, now echoed with absence. Harold woke up in the guest bedroom alone, the master suite locked, its door cold and unmoving. Lillian hadn't returned home after the party. He sat at the edge of the bed for a long time, his hands trembling slightly, as he tried to collect his thoughts. The night replayed in his head over and over, Lillian's calm exit, the stairs, the footage. That footage, his own face, exposed, broadcast like a criminal, caught mid-act. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes, not fury, not heartbreak. Something worse. Clarity. The house felt hollow without her. He walked past her garden without looking at it, past the kitchen where she always left the tea steeping just right, and into the living room where framed photos of anniversaries, vacations, and birthdays still stood. Ghosts of a life now split in two. He picked up one photo, Lillian in Rome, laughing beneath a sun hat, and placed it face down. Lillian, meanwhile, was hundreds of miles away. She had packed her bags in silence and left town just before sunrise, boarding a plane bound for Florence. No long notes, no angry voicemails. Just a brief message left with Madison, "Tell them I'm fine. I need air." In the days that followed, news of the party spread quietly, then quickly. The footage meant to be seen by a private group leaked within 48 hours. A guest had filmed the screen from their seat and uploaded it to a private social media account. But secrets don't stay private for long. The video circulated among local circles, whispered about over brunches, dinner parties, and hospital break rooms. The headline practically wrote itself: "Beloved retired doctor exposed by wife at his own birthday party." Harold didn't leave the house for days. His phone stopped ringing. Messages from old colleagues were cold, brief, or non-existent. A charity board he once chaired quietly removed his name from their website. Even the neighbors seemed to disappear when he stepped outside. Ava resigned from nursing entirely. Her agency released a bland statement about policy violations and inappropriate relationships before scrubbing her profile. She moved out of Charleston that week, leaving no forwarding address. Her silence only deepened the scandal. For Harold, the humiliation wasn't what hurt most. It was the permanence of it. The realization that everything he had spent decades building, his marriage, his reputation, his dignity, had shattered in 7 minutes of video. Lillian, however, didn't dwell in bitterness. In Italy, she began to breathe again. She walked ancient streets, sat in sun-dappled cafes, and let the ache inside her thaw into something stronger. She wasn't angry anymore. She was awake, and with every step she took away from the version of herself that had tolerated Harold's indifference, she began to reclaim the woman she had once been: sharp, brave, and unafraid of silence. She filed for divorce quietly. There was no courtroom battle, no fighting over property, just a clean break. The house was sold. The proceeds split. The garden dug up and replanted by the next owners, who never knew what had bloomed there before. Months later, Lillian started speaking at small women's groups about resilience, reinvention, and the power of truth. She didn't name Harold. She didn't have to. Her story had already been seen. And Harold? He lived alone in a modest apartment on the edge of town. No birthday parties. No visitors. Just silence and memories that wouldn't leave. What was meant to be a celebration had become his undoing. But for Lillian, it was a beginning.